Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my first power rankings for the 2025 F1 season. Yesterday's race pretty hectic, lots of crashes. I think lots of different ways to differentiate the 20 drivers on the grid. So starting off right away with number 20, definitely a weekend to forget for this driver. And let's see, where's my mouse? Oh, there it is. Mouse over there. So number 20, I'm going with Liam Lawson. Really tough weekend for the Kiwi. Really struggled for pace all weekend long. Qualifying went pretty poorly. Qualified 18th, knocked out in Q1, out-qualified by Verstappen by 1.076 seconds. And just for context, Sergio Perez, over his 4 years as teammates with Verstappen, was only out-qualified by that big of a margin or bigger 10 times. And again, out of those 10 sessions, most of them wet sessions, and the qualifying session that we had on Saturday definitely was not wet. So not a great start for Lawson. Race pace also wasn't particularly strong. Stuck behind the Hasses for most of the race, and even then wasn't really catching up to Bortoleto even after that. And his race ended with that kind of somewhat silly spin at turn 2. But that being said, with those conditions, slick tires on a very wet track, very easy to make a mistake in those conditions. But still, I felt overall Lawson was probably one of the worst performing drivers of the weekend. But that being said, I think there's quite a few drivers you could make that argument for. Number 19, I'm going with Isaac Hadjar. Qualifying honestly was pretty good. Qualified 11th, out-qualified by Yuki Tsunoda by 1.6 tenths of a second. But unfortunately, having such a silly mistake on the formation lap before the race even gets going, spinning on the second corner nonetheless, was, unfortunately puts him down in 19th. Not really sure how he would have done in the race based on how the other rookies did. He probably would have crashed somewhere later in the Grand Prix anyway. But nonetheless, for Hadjar, a pretty horrific opening weekend. You never want to start your first Grand Prix without, by crashing out on the formation lap that way. But the good news for Hadjar, I guess, is that there's nowhere to go but up from here. Number 18, I'm going to go with Carlos Sainz. For Sainz, he qualified 10th, out-qualified by Albon by 3.25 tenths of a second. So qualifying, not so great, I would say. And then I think of the two first lap crashes, I think his was probably the worst of the two because it was after the safety car had already come out. It was the final corner. Again, he kind of put the crash down to some kind of throttle power burst, something like that. Maybe if he had spent more time in the Williams under safety car procedures, he would have known what would have happened. But again, still a pretty silly crash at a pretty slow speed corner. So not a great opening weekend for Sainz at Williams, but I'm sure he'll bounce back. Number 17, I'm going with Jack Doohan. For Doohan, home Grand Prix qualified 14th, out qualified officially by 7.5 tenths of a second, but I do believe his final run in Q2, he was massively hindered by Hamilton spinning. And if you compare just the Q1 times, he was actually a little bit faster than Gasly. So qualifying, I think, was okay. Race, unfortunately, not so good. Basically spun on a straight between turns 5, turn 6. I think put the tires on one of the white painted lines and basically went around. He went. I know, really silly crash, but again, one of those crashes where I think it was a very small mistake, but big consequences. I think his crash was a little bit less silly than Sainz, which is part of the reason why he's ahead of the Spanish driver. Number 16, I'm going with Oliver Bearman. I think going into the race, I think many people would have had Bearman at or near the bottom of their driver rankings just even before the race got going. And, his Grand Prix wasn't particularly strong, but I think he, just on the basis of finishing the Grand Prix, that kind of moves him up to 16th, which is kind of tells you about what kind of race it was. So qualifying doesn't even set a time in qualifying, has that gearbox issue, likely caused by one of his two crashes in free practice. Not a great way to start your first full season of F1. Of course, crashed in FP1 and then crashed in FP3 as well. Didn't get any running in FP2. So definitely not a great way to start. Pretty far off the pace of Ocon, his teammate, as well. But again, given how little track running, the fact that the conditions were so tricky as well, not a big surprise for that. So for Bearman, I'm putting him 16th. Number 15, I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso. For Alonso, qualified 12th. Qualifying, I think, was okay. Out-qualified Stroll by 300ths of a second, so not a massive margin there. The race was okay, not really moving forward, but again, given the conditions, no one was really making that many overtakes anyway. So again, that's not really a minus on his part, but again, he was one of the few drivers who did crash out, but I did feel on the basis of the fact that, the rest of his weekend wasn't too bad. His crash also happened quite a bit later in the Grand Prix as well. It seemed like he spun on some gravel at turn 6. That's why I do have him ahead of some of those other drivers beneath him. Number 14, I'm going to go with Gabriel Bortoleto. He qualified, he qualified 15th, out-qualified his teammate Hulkenberg by 600ths of a second, so very impressive there, got his Sauber into Q2. Unfortunately, spun at turn 13 and ended up crashing into the barrier. I've seen some reports of a damaged suspension that caused that spin. Haven't seen that for sure, but that being said, again, I'm not entirely sure if the spin was caused by a suspension failure, or if that suspension failure came a little bit later after contact with the wall. But nonetheless, I think out of the drivers who crashed, Bortoleto, I think, probably had the best race. And again, similar to Lawson, they both crashed in very, very tricky conditions when they were on the slick tires on a very, very wet track. So yeah, for Bortoleto, I think as well, amongst the rookies, I think probably second best rookie from the opening weekend. And again, I think if this had been a less chaotic Grand Prix, probably finishes the race and probably, finishes, somewhere between like 12th and 15th or so. So not a terrible opening Grand Prix for Bortoleto by any means. All right, number 13, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton. So Hamilton qualified 8th, out-qualified by his teammate Leclerc by 0.2 of a second. Yes, qualifying not super great. And then in the race, I think got stuck behind basically Albon for the whole race. And yeah, pace was not particularly strong. Of course, massively hurt by the strategy as well, but it just felt like for Hamilton, he was really, really struggling, just didn't have the pace in the car. And again, Bennett, all the credit to him for not crashing the car in those conditions, but still, I felt like it wasn't a particularly strong debut for Hamilton. Number 12, I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon. For Ocon, qualified 19th, qualified dead last, but unfortunately for him, the Haas looks to be quite the handful, and it seems like the sandbagging that we thought they were doing in winter testing turns out maybe it wasn't sandbagging after all. And it seems like at this point in time, the Haas was probably the slowest car on track in Australia. Finished the race, didn't have any big incidents. Strategy was a disaster, but don't really blame him for that. Beat his teammate. I think unfortunate for him that he wasn't able to, finish a little higher, perhaps get a point or two. But for Ocon, I do feel like he realistically did pretty close to the best he could. But so I think 12th is a pretty good spot for him. Number 11, I'm going to go with Pierre Gasly. For Gasly, qualified 9th, out-qualified his teammate by 7.5 tenths. But like I said earlier, not entirely representative of the true gap between the two of them. As Doohan got caught out on that final lap in qualifying by Hamilton, spinning in Q2. But for Gasly, I think he looked like he was going to score points for a large portion of that race. Unfortunately, I believe in the closing 10-15 laps or so, went a little bit wide at turn 1, went through that puddle, and lost position to both Ferraris, and I think eventually Piastri as well, to unfortunately finish right outside of the points, which I think, based on the pace in the car this weekend, I think was a little bit unfortunate for them. But that being said, overall, I don't think it was a terrible Grand Prix by Gasly. Number 10, Charles Leclerc. So for Leclerc, qualified 7th, out-qualified Hamilton by 0.2 of a second, finished 8th in the race, but that, of course, doesn't really tell the full story. Good start for him, got up to 5th place, was looking to have a really, really solid Grand Prix from there. But unfortunately, during kind of the lap 40 chaos when the rain came, when everyone was on slicks, had a bit of a spin, lost a couple of positions, I believe, to Tsunoda and to Hamilton as well. Although I think he actually had already lost a position to Hamilton, to Tsunoda, but nonetheless lost a position to Hamilton. Eventually got that position back, but at that point, the damage had already been done. So I think an okay weekend by Leclerc, but again, not amazing. Number 9, I'm going to go with Antonelli. Qualifying, not so super strong. Qualified 16th, out-qualified by his teammate Russell by 0.5 of a second. Now, again, he did have floor damage during qualifying, apparently from going over a curb. I know he was taking the curbs very, very aggressively, and I do think there was, perhaps a little bit of luck involved in, the fact that he was the one who ended up with damage to his car. And in fact, apparently that damage was costing him about 0.3 of a second a lap. So again, a little unfortunate, but I think qualifying pace, again, it's something that we'll have to watch out for in the coming races. I think the race overall was okay. He made his way up to 11th or 12th right behind Alonso for the first stint in the race, and really he was one of the only drivers who was actually able to overtake in those conditions. That being said, he was in a pretty fast car, again, overtaking much slower cars, which is to be expected, when you're driving a Mercedes, overtaking Saubers and Aston Martins. But, again, he kept it clean, kept it in the wall. So again, really massive kudos to him there. I think really one of several drivers, and we'll get to a couple of them later, but he was one of several drivers who I think really benefited from the strategy call to go onto the intermediate tires for the second pit stop. And again, that really helped him to finish where he ended up finishing, which was 4th. Otherwise, he probably doesn't even finish in the points or finishes in the very low points paying positions. But nonetheless, I think decent first Grand Prix for Antonelli. Number 8 is Oscar Piastri. What a Grand Prix for Piastri. Looks so close, almost so certain that he was going to get Australia's first ever podium for an Australian driver at that Grand Prix. But unfortunately, one tiny mistake at turn 13 when that cell of rain came basically took that podium away in an instant. Otherwise, I think, Piastri outside that one moment had an excellent Grand Prix. Qualifying again shows he was lacking a little bit in pace compared to Norris. So again, I think qualifying there's a little bit of ultimate pace there. Lost position of Verstappen at the start, so again that was less than ideal, but was able to overtake him when Verstappen made that mistake at turn 11. Then through the middle portion of the race was at points the fastest driver on track, even faster than his teammate, but did make a couple mistakes here and there. Made a mistake at turn 6, lost a couple of seconds there. And again, when the rain came at turn 13, I believe it was, both Norris, and Piastri went off as they were the first drivers. And so I do give a little bit of leniency there. But, Norris did just that much better of a job of just keeping the car on track, not losing control the way that Piastri did. Which eventually he ended up beached almost in the runoff for turn 13. So the rain came turn 12, not turn 13. Sorry about that. And then took him forever, to get back in the race. And after that, had a great pace and a couple of good overtakes, especially that one on Hamilton. But nonetheless, I think, overall, taking all things into consideration, I still think it was a pretty good Grand Prix by Piastri, just with that one unfortunate mistake costing so much. Now, number 7, I'm going to go with Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, qualifying was okay, not amazing, but not terrible otherwise. Qualified by Alonso by 0.03 of a second, so relatively close there. And then in the race, I think the pace was not amazing. Was like a little bit slower than Alonso, but kept it clean, which in today's conditions meant that, you ended up with quite a haul of points if you kept it clean. And really benefited from the strategy, similar to Antonelli and similar to the driver in front of him in my power rankings. And so those two things really helped. But that being said, the fact that he kept it clean, we didn't see any footage of him making any big mistakes, slide spins going off in the gravel. So again, I think that's worthy of a 7th on my power rankings. Number 6, I'm going to go with Nico Hülkenberg. Very, very similar situation to Stroll. Slightly out-qualified by Bortoleto. By, let's see, what was it, 600ths of a second, which was shockingly close to my prediction in my preview. But after that, in the Grand Prix, decent start, got ahead of Bortoleto, and the pace looked okay. Kept it clean, kept on track, and again, just like Stroll, benefited from the strategy and picked up 6 hard-fought points for Sauber. So for Hülkenberg, pretty good weekend, but I really felt like there was Stroll, Hülkenberg were kind of in a similar boat, and then a pretty big gap to the drivers in the top 5. So taking a look at the first of those drivers, and that is Alex Albon. So for Albon, qualified 6th, out-qualified Sainz by 3.2 tenths, finished 5th in the Grand Prix. Basically lost position to Leclerc at the start, but the rest of the Grand Prix held off Hamilton. I think in terms of strategy for pit stops, I believe he pitted at the same time as Russell. and then just kept it clean and brought it home to a fifth place on the road. Of course, got temporarily promoted to fifth on the road, temporarily promoted to fourth. And then, of course, Antonelli got his penalty rescinded, so that dropped him back down to fifth. But all in all, very, very strong opening Grand Prix of the season for Albon. That was his best result as a Williams driver, so yeah, excellent job for him. Now, number 4, I'm going with Yuki Tsunoda, qualified fifth. Out-qualified his teammate Hadjar by 1.6 tenths. Was only 2 tenths off Verstappen in the Red Bull, which I think tells you quite a bit about, one, how strong the Racing Bulls car was this weekend, and how good Tsunoda's performance was in qualifying, but also how maybe Red Bull is lacking a little bit in pace. So for Tsunoda, I think start of the race was very, very good, very similar to Albon, just stayed ahead of him. I think the cars were similar pace this weekend, so that's why I'm putting Tsunoda ahead of Albon in my power rankings. But unfortunately for Tsunoda, really bad luck with the strategy. Basically stayed up 1 or 2 laps too long on slick tires when it started raining again, and that sent him back down the field to 12th. Didn't see him spin or go off, but just unfortunately being on the wrong tire at the wrong time meant that you lost a ton of time, and that time was basically enough to send him from a very high points scoring position out of the points. Not really his fault, which is why he's still pretty high in my power rankings. Now on to the top 3, which coincidentally this weekend's happens to be the 3 drivers on the podium. So starting number 3, we have George Russell. I think for George, very low-key weekend. We didn't see a whole lot of him, but kept it very clean, very quick, and was rewarded with a podium in the end, picking up the pieces after Piastri basically spun out of contention. So for Russell, qualified 4th, out-qualified his teammate Antonelli by 5.5 tenths, and then the Grand Prix finished 3rd on the road. Never really challenged Verstappen in the first 2 phases of the race. It felt like Verstappen was basically kind of driving in a league of his own. Basically, you had at the midpoint before Alonso's crash, you basically had the 2 McLarens. You had a massive gap to Verstappen and then a massive gap further back to Russell. And I do feel like the Mercedes and the Red Bull were, in similar, the cars were about similarly strong this weekend. So again, I do feel like he wasn't quite as good as Verstappen, but nonetheless, I think still a really overall really strong drive from Russell. Now, number 1, number 2. So we have 2 drivers left, Verstappen, Norris. Who do I put number 1? Who do I put number 2? So let's see. So number 2, I have Lando Norris, and number 1, I have Max Verstappen. Let's discuss. So first for Norris, takes pole, out-qualifies his teammate by 0.08 of a second, and then, of course, wins the Grand Prix. Kept the lead at the start. Pretty good pace in the opening stint, but was, under pressure from Verstappen at points. And then Verstappen obviously makes that mistake, wasn't able to... I think one of the things I noticed was that Verstappen was the first driver to start moving offline to cool his tires. And I really think that he was really, really struggling to keep up the pace with McLaren. So I think that was one thing. So I think it was quite clear as well. McLaren had the strongest car this weekend by a good amount. And then after that, I think Norris it seemed like he was struggling. Again, you might say that he was just managing the pace, but there were points where Piastri was definitely the stronger of the 2 McLarens in the race. And generally in cold conditions and raining conditions as well, you generally don't back off the pace because you usually have to keep the pace up in order to keep temperature into the tire. So I really do feel like there were points where there's points in time where Piastri was the stronger of the 2 McLaren, the faster of the 2 McLaren drivers. That was a genuine pace advantage for Piastri. I think controlled the restarts pretty well after the safety car, and then I think in the initial pit stop phase to the switching to the hard tires, I think he was after that he was fine and was very, very quick, but unfortunately like Piastri got caught out by the rain cell. And again, similar to past Grand Prix like last year's British Grand Prix, I think that when you're the first driver to hit the rain cell, again, it's understandable why you would go off, and it's really just trying to do the best you could. But nonetheless, I think it was a very, very strong Grand Prix, but I do feel like Verstappen was just a little bit better. So for Verstappen, qualified 3rd, I think that was really the best he could have done in qualifying. Out-qualified, lost him by a second, like I said. And then in the race, I think he had the best start of the 3 actually. He just unfortunately got boxed in by Norris, so we couldn't really challenge him. But yeah, took Piastri off the line in turn 2, and then I think stuck with Norris as long as he could. Of course, he had that small mistake himself at turn 11, but again, like I said, I think it was more the tires going off than anything else. And I think he did a really good job controlling the pace and did the best he could. And even at the end of the race, when they were on the intermediate tires, despite the fact that McLaren was the faster car, in those wet conditions where the car advantage was, neutralized somewhat, Verstappen was basically a match for Norris. And even despite that, with the fact is that usually the stronger cars will still be the strongest cars in the wet conditions as well. It just neutralizes that advantage a little bit. So the fact that is that when those conditions were wettest, Verstappen I think was quicker, or if not as quick as Norris. And I think for that reason, I think he was the strongest driver this past weekend. Not taking anything away from Norris, I think very, very close between those two. And even, you could throw Russell in there as well. So there you go. There's my power rankings for the 2025 Australian Grand Prix. I'll be back later this week with my preview for the Chinese Grand Prix, which of course is this coming weekend. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.